3:10 a.m., August 21, 1942. On Guadalcanal, the night felt unnaturally still. The moon hung low over the Pacific, casting a pale silver sheen across the narrow sand spit at the mouth of Alligator Creek. The tide was out, exposing the shallow crossing that connected the jungle-covered eastern bank to the Marine defensive line on the west. The water barely rippled. The jungle breathed quietly. Somewhere in the distance, insects hummed. Then the stillness broke. Dark shapes emerged from the tree line, first a handful, then dozens, then hundreds, moving quickly and deliberately toward the creek. Nearly 200 Japanese soldiers surged forward, boots splashing softly in the water, rifles held tight, bayonets fixed, officers whispering commands. They believed they were executing a textbook night assault. They believed the Americans were weak, scattered, unprepared. They believed this would be over in minutes. On the western bank, Marines lay motionless behind sandbags and shallow fighting positions. Fingers rested near triggers. Eyes stared through iron sights. Machine gunners tracked the movement without firing, counting distances in their heads as the enemy closed in. 20 yards. 15. 10. Close enough now to see faces, pale in the moonlight. Close enough to hear labored breathing and whispered orders in Japanese. Close enough for grenades to be thrown. Every instinct screamed to open fire. Every Marine manual ever written said engage at maximum range. Every veteran knew that letting the enemy get this close was how positions were overrun. But that night, the Marines did not fire. They waited. Because this battle was not being fought on instinct. It was being fought on mathematics. Major General Alexander Van de Grift had made a decision that defied everything Marine Corps doctrine stood for. He had deliberately allowed the enemy to approach to point-blank range. He had done so because he believed warfare could be engineered. That terrain could be measured. That firepower could be synchronized. That geometry could replace improvisation. For 2 weeks, while Japanese commanders underestimated American strength, Van de Grift had been quietly transforming the defense of Guadalcanal into something no army had ever attempted before. He studied the land not like a traditional general, but like a civil engineer designing a bridge. Where would pressure concentrate? Where would movement be forced? Where could fire converge? The answer was Alligator Creek. The terrain made the decision unavoidable. To the north lay the open ocean, offering no concealment. To the south, dense jungle growth made large-scale movement nearly impossible. Between them, the creek curved toward the sea, forming a narrow sand spit that served as the only practical crossing point at low tide. Any serious attack from the east would have to pass through that corridor. Van de Grift saw it immediately. This was not just ground. It was a funnel. And funnels could be weaponized. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Marines, initially struggled with what Van de Grift was asking of his men. Marine doctrine emphasized aggression, constant pressure, and meeting the enemy as far forward as possible. But Van de Grift wanted the opposite. He wanted the enemy to come, to commit fully, to walk into a pre-measured killing zone where every weapon would fire not in reaction, but in sequence. Pollock understood the psychological toll this would take. Asking Marines to hold fire while armed enemies close to grenade range went against every survival instinct they possessed. But as Pollock walked the ground again and again, checking fields of fire, measuring distances, aligning weapons, the logic became undeniable. This was not passive defense. This was controlled destruction. Machine guns were positioned with surgical precision. Water-cooled M1917A1 Brownings were chosen specifically because they could sustain prolonged fire without overheating. Each gun was assigned a sector, and every sector overlapped with another. There would be no dead ground. Mortars and artillery from the 11th Marines were pre-registered during daylight hours. Distances were measured. Bearings recorded. Firing data calculated so that at night, in total darkness, gunners could dial in coordinates and fire with mathematical accuracy. And at the heart of the plan were the 37mm anti-tank guns, repurposed for infantry defense, loaded with M2 canister rounds. Each shell contained 122 steel balls. At close range, they would turn the sand spit into a wall of flying metal. Private First Class Pomeroy manned one of the machine guns along the creek. He had trained his entire career to engage targets at hundreds of yards. His Browning could reach nearly 1,000 under ideal conditions. Yet now he was being told to wait until the enemy was close enough to touch. He rehearsed the plan in his mind over and over. Trust the math. Trust the overlap. Trust the canister guns. Still, as the Japanese soldiers moved closer, his heart pounded. He could see their faces now. These were not shadows. They were men. Armed men. Coming straight at him. Company G waited in reserve, their role perhaps the most difficult of all. They would not fire unless the system failed. They were the final variable, the contingency plan. If any Japanese broke through, Company G would counterattack instantly, sealing the breach before it could expand. They waited in silence, knowing that if they were needed, something had already gone wrong. The Japanese assault moved with confidence. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki believed completely in what he was doing. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had enjoyed almost uninterrupted success. Night attacks had shattered Chinese defenses repeatedly. Intelligence suggested the Americans on Guadalcanal were few, inexperienced, and demoralized. Ichiki commanded 917 elite troops. He believed sheer spirit and aggression would be enough. He had no idea nearly 11,000 Marines were waiting. He had no idea he was walking into a precisely engineered trap. When the lead elements reached 10 yards, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock gave the order. Fire! The night erupted. The 37mm guns fired first. Canister rounds detonated across the sand spit, releasing cones of steel that ripped through the tightly packed assault force. Entire ranks fell instantly. Before shock could register, the machine guns opened up. Interlocking streams of fire swept the crossing from edge to edge. Pomeroy pressed the trigger and felt the familiar vibration as his Browning cycled at a sustained rate. The water jacket steamed. The traverse mechanism moved smoothly as he swept his sector exactly as trained. There was nowhere to hide. Nowhere to run. The assault collapsed into chaos. Some Japanese soldiers, driven by training and desperation, pushed forward through the storm of fire. A few reached the western bank. Grenades exploded. Bayonets flashed in the dark. For a moment, the geometry bent. But it did not break. Company G surged forward, counterattacking immediately, eliminating the breach before it could grow. The system held. Japanese mortars answered. Shells crashed among Marine positions, lighting the battlefield in brief, hellish flashes that revealed the scale of destruction. Bodies lay scattered across the sand in patterns that reflected the geometry of overlapping fire. The Marines held their ground, scanning for movement, adjusting fire, maintaining discipline. A second assault came. It died even faster. The kill zone had been refined. Timing improved. No one made it through. A final desperate attempt to flank through the surf met machine gun fire and pre-registered artillery. Japanese soldiers waded chest-deep through water, weapons held overhead, moving slowly, exposed. They were cut down where they stood. As dawn broke, Van de Grift ordered the final phase. Marines crossed upstream, enveloping the enemy position. Tanks rolled forward in daylight. Aircraft from Henderson Field strafed escape routes. By evening, organized resistance had ended. Nearly 800 Japanese soldiers were dead. Fewer than 50 Americans had been killed. The exchange ratio was staggering. The implications were revolutionary. Colonel Ichiki was dead. His doctrine had failed. The Marines had proven that warfare could be reduced to equations. That defense, when engineered with precision, could destroy superior attacking forces. Weeks later, the same principles would shatter a much larger Japanese assault at Edson's Ridge. The template held. Private Pomeroy examined his machine gun after the battle. The barrel was still warm. The weapon had performed exactly as designed. Just like the plan. Just like the math. At Alligator Creek, the Marines learned a lesson that would echo across the Pacific. Victory did not always belong to the strongest or the bravest. Sometimes, it belonged to those who turned chaos into calculation, who trusted geometry over instinct, and who solved the problem at 20 yards. Warfare would never be the same.